Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hello and welcome to Missing Frames' continuing Celebrating Superman series. I'm your host, Shawn Eastridge. Normally on Missing Frames, we watch all of the movies we should have seen by this point in our lives. But seeing as how I'm a massive Superman fan, I've basically just transformed this podcast into a giant Superman party. So in the months leading up to the release of James Gunn's new film on July 11th, I'm talking to some of my absolute favorite Superman comic creators, writers, filmmakers, fans, and more. In my last episode, I got to chat with Philip Kennedy Johnson, who is awesome. He's the brilliant writer behind the War World saga and the upcoming Book of El series. We also had a follow-up conversation via Instagram Live. Neither of us had ever done an Instagram Live before. I think it went all right. You can find it either on my Instagram account, which is just at Shondorman, or Philip's Instagram account, which is at Philip K. Johnson. And you can also go to the Nerd Party's YouTube channel and find it there. However you choose to find it, just the important thing is to find it. I really had a great time. Both conversations were amazing. So in today's episode, I'm talking with another one of the all-time great Superman writers, and that is Dan Jurgens. Dan has been writing and or illustrating Superman comics since like the late 80s, almost 40 years. It was right at the tail end of John Byrne's run, which started in 86 and ended, I think, in 89. And if you actually look at the data, like on paper, I don't think there's anyone on the planet who has written and illustrated more Superman comics than Dan. Calling his impact on the character's legacy monumental might actually be an understatement. Not only that, he's still writing comics today. His Action Comics Rebirth run, which is now a decade old, I know that's insane to think about. Not only is that amazing, but his continuing contributions to other characters are also amazing. He's written for a certain Dark Knight recently. I don't know if you've heard of this character, but people seem to love him. I don't know how I feel. I mean, a guy who dresses up like a bat clearly has issues. But Dan's he's still writing. He's got more stuff on the way. Like, this guy is absolutely nuts. So, of course, what an honor to talk with him. We had to talk about his work on the death and return of Superman's story arc. I mean, he's the guy who actually wrote and illustrated issue number 75 of Superman, which is the issue in which Superman is killed by Doomsday. But we also talked about all of his other amazing work too. And we talk about what it was like visiting the set of James Gunn's film last year with a bunch of other amazing comic book people, and how we're feeling about the new film. I'm so grateful to Dan for hanging out with me. I mean, he's a legend. So let's go ahead and celebrate Superman with Dan Jurgens.
Now available to own on video cassette.
Well, Dan, first and foremost, this may be the most important thing we talk about today. There are going to be a lot of important things talked about, but I have to know, it's the day after the new Superman trailer has been released. Did you watch it, and how are you feeling about it?
Well, of course I watched it, yes. I'm feeling great about it, although I do wish it was coming out a little sooner. It's still a long wait. I mean, we're looking at almost
2 months. Who do they think we are? I don't have the time to wait for this stuff. I need it now.
Well, that's, isn't that kind of the funny thing about we see trailers for whatever movie it might be, and we always wish, yeah, okay, I'm ready to go see that. And then, so we just have to let that build for 2 months. But I'm certainly looking forward to it. There seems to be a lot there to like. And I think seemed to be
there's a lot of triangle influence in there.
Well, I don't know about that. But certainly a lot of, classic Superman elements, if you will, that are there. And yeah, very much looking forward.
Is there a moment that you were like, I'm pumped, I'm ready, I'm going to be cheering, standing up in the theater, out of my seat at this moment?
Well, there are a couple, but I think one of them for me is we get a very small glimpse of Superman's fortress, just kind of like building itself up in the Arctic, and it looks like a great effect. We saw a couple of interior scenes of the fortress that I think look quite captivating as well. So for me, I think it's just that once again that those basic Superman elements that have survived from the comics into previous movies, as well as television, that I enjoy seeing because those are part of what makes Superman Superman.
And you got to visit the set. I don't need to know the details. I know you're not allowed. You've probably signed a zillion NDAs, so I
Yep.
am not going to know any details. But how was the vibe of the trip, and how was that just getting to go there? And I feel like there's a lot of times it feels like with the comic book films, and this has changed a little bit. I think we've seen it change maybe with the way the Marvel Cinematic Universe has worked and the way Kevin Feige has worked, but it's always felt like the movies are like they exist in their own sphere and the comics are over here. And the comics inspire what we see in the movies, but they don't
Hmm.
overlap a lot. Or for whatever reason, the filmmakers aren't as interested in interacting with the original creators and writers. But James seems like a massive fan, and I loved seeing that photo of you and Jason Aaron and who else was there? Jim Lee.
Jim was there. Josh Williamson was there.
Yeah,
Uh, I'm trying.
Frank
Scott
Quietly.
Snyder was there.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jason Aaron. Boy, I'm drawing a blank on every. It was actually a year ago now that we were there. So
Wow. I
it's
remember
a little
seeing that
bit.
photo and just being so pumped and being so happy that you guys got to do that and that you were. It's so clear that James loves what you've done and the stuff you've contributed. It's so crucial to who Superman is, and to see that kind of acknowledged and to see you guys getting to experience that was really really cool.
It was, and it was definitely cool to be there. And I think the vibe we all walked away with was one of extreme positivity in what we got to see and the stuff we were exposed to. So we're all looking forward to it. And not that I can speak for the rest, but I just know how we all walked out of there and the way we were feeling, and just really had a really super positive experience there. And some of it was just when. Um, as we were standing there at that time, there had not been any photos released of the costume or anything else. So to see
Yeah, that's
Superman
right.
walk out, in costume, and see how the cape draped off his shoulders, nice and long, almost down to the floor. I mean, it just started out with that really positive sense and continued from there.
That's awesome. I'm glad you got to do that. Let's
Yeah.
talk about you and your childhood. Do you have an early first memory of Superman that you can recall?
I vaguely remember seeing the TV show, the old, George Reeve
Yeah.
black and white TV show. Uh, but it was very much on and off in the area I grew up in. But like I do have this vague memory of seeing it, being somewhat captivated by it. But for me, really, it would have been two things that came around the same time. One was Filmation was doing a Superman cartoon. So we're talking mid 60s, right in that era. And at the same time, the first comic book I ever bought was a Superman comic book.
Do you remember what the story was in that?
I believe was it Superman 189? Not 100% sure of the number, but on the cover, Superman is sort of, it's done by Kurt Swan. Superman is landing on a planet, and Crypto is on the ground, no cape, but Crypto is on the ground barking at him, and Superman has a thought balloon that says something like "Great sons, Crypto hates me" or something like that. But that was the first comic I ever bought, and so right away I started thinking, yeah, Superman's pretty cool.
And at what point did you start thinking about like, not only is Superman cool, but comics in general are pretty cool. Actually, I think I want to start doing my own.
Oh man, it was really soon. So to even go back right before I bought that first comic, I didn't even know what comics were. And the Batman live action TV show was on at that time. And at that time, not just reruns, it was live, primetime TV show at that point. And I was just captivated by that. And one night I was out walking through the neighborhood one summer night, and there were a couple of kids older than me sitting on the front stoop of their house looking at these four color pamphlets. And I walked up, what are you guys doing? Right. And they showed me these things that they said were comic books. And that was literally my first exposure to comics. And one of them had like the 25-cent giant that reprinted Robin Dies at Dawn. And so
Right.
there's Batman carrying a dead Robin. And I just said, wait, what is this? Robin can't be dead. I just saw him on TV. Because you're a kid, you're like 7 years old and making those
Right.
associations. And I started looking through them. I was hooked at that point, which is why I had to go buy my own.
Hmm.
And then, a couple of years later, I started to feel like, these aren't just stamped out by a machine. I see names and credits, things like that, ideas that led me to believe that, yeah, people really were generating these things. And, before long, I was kind of writing and drawing my own stories, and the interest was always there.
Yeah. And at what point did you start to think like how, it's a hobby and it's something you love as a kid. And then when did you start thinking about it professionally? Did you go to school for it? Were you thinking like this is a career I could make for myself, or was it kind of unattainable at the time?
I was probably around 14 when I really started to think, this is something that maybe I can do, and maybe I can make work out some way, somehow. And so at the same time, I was also very, very interested in a career in the arts some way, somehow. And ultimately, I did go and pursue an education that way. And it's interesting to note. So we're talking like late 70s, mid late 70s. And at that time, if you go back to the Comics Journal and a lot of other publications, basically they were saying comics are dead. They're not going to exist in 3 years.
Right.
And, so as I was there, I focused a bit on illustration. I majored in graphic design, and but I kept my interest in comics, and always pursued those more or less on the side. And eventually, Mike Grell, who had created The Warlord as writer and artist, was visiting the area I lived in. I stopped and on the way home from work one night, and I just met him at his signing and all of that, and showed him some stuff. And it just so happened at the same time, they were kind of interested in finding a new artist on Warlord. Mike was no longer drawing it; someone else was, and so he said, "Look, here's what I want you to do: get these samples in front of the editor, who at that time was Lori Sutton, and within just a couple of months, I was drawing the book."
It sounds like, I mean, the entry point was for you illustrating professionally. Like that was what
Yeah.
got you your first. Were you writing as a kid and writing a lot, or were you thinking about writing stories at all? With comics, I mean, what people, you kind of take it for granted, but the storytelling is so intertwined as far as the artist and the writer. Like sometimes the writer hands off a script, and other times the artist is the one driving the story and the writer just fills it in afterwards. But were you
Right.
passionate about doing both, or one versus the other at the time?
Even as a kid, I read a lot. And I mean, beyond comics, and certainly was very much interested in this idea of expressing myself as a writer. And so once I was in comics, from the start, I was letting people know I was going to write as well, one way or another. I mean, I was just going to end up doing it. And some of it was even starting to work with someone like Grell, who was a writer artist. I was very much influenced by the other guys who were doing it at the time, like, Howard Chaykin, Jim Starlin, John Byrne. I mean, the list is long. And I thought that really, in terms of generating comic books, there's a purity to that you could see come through the work in a lot of ways. So I made that clear, and DC was willing to listen and give me the opportunities. And I managed to write a couple of things for them so that when I brought them the concept of Booster Gold, which was
Mm,
like late 84, they were ready to go and said,
yeah.
yeah, we like what we see here. Let's give this a shot.
So that was really your big, like that was your big creative breakthrough, was Booster Gold, as far as like combining your creative love with the professional. Like now I'm going to be doing it officially.
Yeah. Prior to that, I had been drawing a book called Sun Devils that
Mm,
I had co-created with Jerry Conway and Roy Thomas. And Jerry was the writer and editor on the book. And after about 5 or 6 issues, his workload was such that they wanted to bring in someone else as writer. And we were talking about this, and I said, wow, who's it going to be? And he, as editor said, well, why don't you do it? It was going to be a 12-issue maxi series. He said, the story. And we had been working Marvel style anyway, which is Jerry would write a plot and I would draw from that. And as I drew it, I would fill in a lot of dialogue notes on the art in the borders and things like that. And so I had the familiarity with the characters and everything. We just decided that was not a totally, bad way to go. And I saw it as much better than that, obviously. So yeah,
Right.
I ended up writing, I think, like the last 5 issues, but that proved to them that I could work a typewriter, which at that time it was a typewriter.
I mean, we got to bring the typewriter back. Maybe not.
Yeah, I don't want to be using whiteout again. It's bad enough to have to use it on art, right? Yeah, I don't want to have
It's
to
nice.
use it on something I typed up.
It looks nice on a table. It looks really pretty, but as far as using it, I think the computer is certainly a nice upgrade for sure.
Yes.
So when did you start making the move into Superman? I know John Byrne rebooted in 86. And then at a certain point, I know others were brought in. Jerry was brought in. And at what point did you start to get involved in that team? And what was the conversation of inviting you into that team?
So at that time, like I said, I would have been writing and drawing Booster. And I remember Mike calling me up one day, and he had seen the pencils to Booster Gold 17 on someone's desk. And he called me up and he said, would you ever be interested in drawing any Superman? And at that time, Byrne was pretty much leaving. And I think we all knew that. I can't remember the exact timing on everything. But I think that was pretty much established. And they were looking for different people. Also at that time, typically, everyone else who was working on Superman pretty much came from Marvel. I mean, Jerry and Marv had already been generating it at DC, and Jerry, doing pencils and I think inks both. But he had also, prior to that, been at Marvel inking John on Fantastic Four. Right. So there was this strong Marvel wave of everybody doing Superman. And Mike asked me if I'd be interested, and I said yes. Now, strangely enough, back when Karen Berger, who went on to create Vertigo, was, editorial coordinator at DC, she called me one day and asked if I had any interest in drawing Superman. And this is pre-John Byrne. And I said, oh, I don't know. I can't draw like Kurt Swan, and only Kurt Swan can draw Superman. Right. But, Mike called and I said, yeah, I'd definitely be interested. And he said, well, I have Jim Starlin writing an annual, and I'd love to have you do it if you're up for it. So it was, I think, Adventures of Superman annual number 1. And as I said, Starlin wrote it. I drew it. And as soon as I got done with that, Mike was giving me, other Superman stuff to do. I think I did backup that went across like 6 issues that Roger Stern wrote that was Luthor and kind of a hostile takeover attempt, something like that. And, then they started to reshape the team. There had been 2 books, and Action, which had been a weekly with different characters in it, was coming back to the fold and everything. And he asked then if I would like to work on Adventures of Superman with George Perez, that George would write and I would draw, while at the same time, George was also drawing Action Comics, I believe. So it was this, once I started on Adventures, or the Adventures of Superman annual, I was never not working on Superman. And it just that the workload, the percentage of my month spent on Superman just continued to increase. And at the same time, Booster Gold was coming to an end with issue 25. And by then I just moved straight on to Superman nonstop.
And how did you feel about, like, you were a fan of Superman growing up and you loved the character. He was your introduction to this world. How did you feel about everything John Byrne was doing? Like, when you came into that, were you excited by the story possibilities and what was happening? Because there were some major changes happening. And had you been able to keep up with it? Had you been able to kind of look at it and say, like, oh, this is really cool, kind of like Lex Luthor is like a billionaire businessman now, and now, like, we've kind of, humanized Clark a little bit more. We're rounding out the supporting cast at the Daily Planet. How did you feel about those changes? Were you excited about them? And what did you, when you came into it, what did you feel like, you know what, I like this, but I want to bring a little bit more of this flavor to it?
So to go back even farther, because I can't address that without going back a bit. So very early in the run, when I was doing Booster Gold, his origin was somewhat tied to Superman's world and a Superman museum and things like that. And in issue 6 of Booster Gold, I was already dealing with some of those elements. And Dick Giordano gave me a call and he said, Dan, we've got a bit of a problem. John Byrne is coming to do Superman and he's going to redo his origin and everything about Krypton. And so we need you to kind of redo Booster's origin and start to work away from this. So from the start, they were sending me Byrne's script and pencils to the miniseries that he did that launched it, which I think was just called Man of Steel. And I just thought it all looked so awesome that I was very intrigued just based on that all of a sudden Superman was looking like a 1980s at that time, which is what it was, comic book. It was modernized. Everything felt different about it. And he really did have, I think, an excellent handle on the character. I mean, and the entire mythos of Superman. He moved Krypton closer to what we had seen in the movie, the first Christopher Reeve movie, though a little more, desert like as opposed to ice like, but
almost
still,
almost more alien, and even a little
yeah,
like they're kind, the Kryptonians in the film are kind of cold and distant, but there was
yes.
that idea of romance and love is not allowed on Krypton, and it's like,
Yeah, it was a very sterile, dry
yes,
planet and society.
yeah,
And I like that he kind of pulled that mood out of the movie, yet at the same time made it its own for the comics.
right,
So and to this day, I think that 6-issue miniseries he did, which relaunched that character, is really a fantastic piece of work because in it, Superman in his entire life were pretty much reframed so that we got this instant understanding of who he is as well as who the other characters were around him. I think it's just a great piece of work. And yes, I was interested in that from the start. And that's why ultimately I said, oh, well, sure, of course, I'll work along with this. And that's where we also set up the idea that one day down the road, we would do a 2-part crossover between Action Comics, which John was doing at that time. And that's right, it wasn't a weekly then. It was more like the version of Brave and Bold, only for
right,
Superman.
gotcha.
And we did a 2-part crossover between Action and Booster Gold. So it was
That's
a lot of
awesome.
fun. And so, yeah, when I came into it, I liked what he was doing. I liked the way the characters were set up. The fact that Ma and Pa Kent were left for him to have a relationship with, I think was brilliant. So, yeah, I very much appreciated that which we were able to inherit.
And it's hard to know when you're like inside the machine working on it, but did you feel the excitement? I mean, this is a major time for Superman. Like, I want to say, like, maybe as far as Superman's popularity in terms of comic books, because we have him starting as the granddaddy of the entire superhero genre in the 30s. And then the movie, I know the film in 78 really kicked off a whole new level of Superman excitement. But as far as the comics were concerned, it feels like this period, like the mid to late 80s and the early 90s, as this team was starting to take over and John left and you guys were stepping in, that really feels like a whole new peak of not only great storytelling for Superman, but a level of awareness and popularity that maybe hadn't been seen before. But did you guys feel that? Did you feel the fans' excitement as you were working on this and thinking like, oh, we're doing something very, very special here? Or was it just hard to hard to deal with that or process that as you're trying to meet your deadlines and hit those timelines?
You as you work as a creator, you do have a sense of what people are thinking about the product you're working on. And it comes in a variety of different ways. And some of it is, back then, people would write letters on paper and actually, or type them out and send them in. So we'd get feedback that way. There were certainly conventions at the time. We were getting feedback that way. But overall, I would say we had the sense that what we were doing was succeeding. And we were, to start with, three books is as far as my relationship with Superman goes. We had Superman, Adventures of Superman, and Action Comics that we kind of sculpted as three books. And we were starting to build this idea of an ongoing way to write it that would keep the subplots going from issue to issue and build it as one big cast where we're all working together rather than just doing our own little stories. And we were very much starting to put that together. And so that when we then added the fourth book, Man of Steel, we sort of had worked out our methodology for how we were going to do it, so that when Louise Simonson and John Bogdanov came on, that we had that in place and we could say, here's how it's working. Come on into the clubhouse and we'll all have fun. And we really had built a way to approach the book that was very much centered on Superman and building the world around him, and sort of this requirement that said, we'd all have to check our ego at the door a little bit and then move on from there.
Mike mentioned that he, out of almost necessity, not being able to follow what was going on between the stories, decided to kind of, all right, let's come up with this triangle idea where we're going to keep the issues going sequentially, and we're going to help readers figure out which one comes next, which story to follow. But for you guys, I know, as exciting as that is as a fan on the outside, that's really great because it's like, great, I know which one to read next. But for you guys, what was the process like of suddenly you're all having to communicate with each other and make sure that everyone is aware of what the overarching story was? Was that fun? Did that make it more challenging and annoying, or how did you feel about it?
Well, it didn't come, all of a sudden. Like I said, we sort of grew into it. And so, when we were just the three books, we did a couple of, really tight crossovers. We did Dark Knight over Metropolis, which was just three issues in 1 month, but it was still a very tight bit of storytelling. We did Time and Time Again, which was another bit like that. And even before those, had done kind of the Eradicator storyline, not the one that we did later with Man of Steel 1,
Right.
but the first one where we have Superman in the gladiator outfit and we've got the Eradicator as just the Kryptonian artifact and the cleric and all that. And so we had some tightness there, and then we would kind of drift away for a bit and do our own thing and then come back together. But even then, at the same time, Mike was making sure that we all knew what the other teams were doing. So, he would be sending us the copies of, and again, this is all hard copy. There was no internet. So
Right.
I'd get my envelope and, here's George Perez's action pages. And here's what Brett Breeding is doing on that as anchor. And here's some Kerry Gamble art. And, here's what Jerry is doing on his book. And so a couple of things happen with that. One, seeing what everybody else does sort of juices you a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Seeing what they do also allows you to tie in and say, my daily planet building is going to look like Jerry's, is going to look like Kerry Gamble's. And so we had that sense of sameness. And the other part is, it does make you a little competitive. And it's like, look at this Ordway page. This thing is so beautiful. Man, I'm going to see if I can top this.
Right.
And you do it in a fun way, right? Because you're sort of challenging each other. So we sort of grew that system of working the way we did. And once the Man of Steel crew came in, where we had essentially the opportunity for a weekly book, then we really had to hit it even harder. And that's when we started to tighten up our storytelling methodologies and how we were all working together. But again, we'd get these packages and they were inspirational. You could look and see what each artist was doing and how they were sculpting their pages. And in a lot of cases, for example, let's say, I think our release schedule was sort of like Man of Steel to Superman to Adventures of Superman to Action.
Mm.
And so if I was drawing an issue of Superman, I might be drawing my first 7 pages before John, who was drawing Man of Steel that month, got his last 7 pages done. So really what he had to do was build his end to match up with my beginning.
Oh,
And
gotcha.
that was a tough thing. We were always working out of order that way. And Mike, as editor, just said, whoever gets to it first,
Right.
So, it's like the famous sequence of Doomsday punching his way out of the cage. I drew that first, and then because I was kind of working ahead, and everybody else kind of worked from that point. So John had to take his Man of Steel sequence and orient it to before what I had drawn in Superman, and then afterwards, Adventures in Action could follow suit. But we were always working out of order that way. But it made for both a fun and very frustrating way of work. That's how it goes.
I mean, that's so cool. I so appreciate as a fan that happened, because it makes it so much fun to go back. Now what's great about having resources like DC Infinite or the omnibuses is it is very easy for a fan in the 21st century to access these stories and read them.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the times the reading order is given to you, but sometimes it's not. But to have those
Right.
tools and all of those ways to read and consume, but also keep the story in line and go in order is so much fun.
Well, yeah, and really the triangles, because we were pretty deep into it before we ever started the triangle approach, right? And it really was driven by readers who were asking us, if I go 2 weeks without reading a Superman comic, then I'm looking at 3, and I don't
Yeah.
remember which one to read first. And it ended up becoming this incredibly simple solution that, like, how could no one have thought of that earlier?
Right.
But it certainly worked out well, and we never would have thought it would get to the point where it would be considered a triangle era.
Yeah, and now you have like these giant omnibuses that are wonderful. And I want to ask you about, I just read a couple years ago for the first time the Superman in Exile story arc, which I
Mhm.
absolutely loved. But I asked Mike about this because I thought it was so funny that John, his last issue of Superman, was making a creative decision that would go down in infamy, which is
Yep.
that Superman executes I think 3 Kryptonian villains. He takes them and says, "I don't know what else to do with you, so I'm gonna get this kryptonite and I'm gonna execute you." And then John was basically like, "All right, you guys, have fun."
Yep.
There is obviously such a debate and conversation around Superman killing and why it's wrong and why it should never happen. And I wonder, just being in the midst of that creative process, seeing that story and seeing that issue, and just like what your thoughts were, and then how you decided. Because what ends up happening, what makes that moment so brilliant, what ends up making that moment John came up with work, is the Exile storyline that followed. So what was it like seeing that big moment, realizing, oh my God, like, how are we gonna handle this? Or the fans gonna rake us over the coals? Like, what were those conversations like, trying to work out what to do with this story wise, so as to not totally forfeit the purity of Superman?
Yeah. So I have 2 different reactions to this. One is just as a reader, in reading it, I thought, wow. And when I say reading it, I mean John's scene where he executes the Phantom Zone criminals. It's like there has to be some correction to this, right? I mean, somewhere we'll find out, what is this, a dream? Did it happen in another
Right.
universe? Did they trick Superman and come back somehow? I mean, it would seem like that's what has to happen, because it didn't seem like Superman in that moment. And as an aside, for everyone who got upset about Superman killing Zod in the movie, at least he did it in order to protect the innocent civilians who were around at the time.
Right.
Whereas in the comic, it was just like cold blooded execution. It's like, here I am with the kryptonite.
Yes.
And that's why even on the cover, he's wearing the executioner hood, right? I mean,
Right.
but then when I came into it, they had already started on the basics of the Exile storyline. And so by the time I came into it, I was aware of where they had started and kind of where they wanted to go with it. And it certainly seemed like very much the right solution at that time. That if you are going to have a character do wrong, it probably is far better to have him, acknowledge the crime, acknowledge the sin, and do his penance, as opposed to saying, "Oh, they tricked him somehow; they're still alive."
Yes,
Which
yeah.
would have been the way it was done in the '70s and '60s.
Yeah, that's the easy way out. And you guys
Yeah.
took the hard way out, but also the more satisfying way out because that storyline is so fantastic and people talk about it to this day and it ended up being so great.
Well, the other part of it is that, and I think this is what we found out very early in the process, that you can introduce the germ of an idea. And in this case, it was the Kryptonian artifact, right? Which ultimately would play a role far greater in the Superman mythos down the line, be it through, being the eradicator or even having some aspect of that involved with cyborg Superman. I was explaining to someone in the office just the other day, as they wanted to try and figure out a way to get rid of the matrix chamber, which is what brought young baby Kal-El to earth,
Mm.
in the Superman mythos. I said, well, the adjustment should take into account everything that grew out of that, because it goes down like 15 different roads. And I think that that's what we started to find out, is you can take a germ of an idea and introduce it and start to build it so it becomes something much bigger later. And that
Mm.
is when we were at our best, what we were always doing on those titles.
I love the story about how you guys started to seriously consider killing Superman for the infamous legendary Death of Superman story arc. Now, as Mike told me, what happened was originally the plan was, Clark and Lois at this point were engaged, and you guys were heading for the story of their wedding. And then the Lois and Clark TV series, something happened where they decided, no, 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 you can't have them get married yet, or there was some conflict, and that was brought back to the writing team. And there was always this running gag as you guys would plan out stories for the year of like, well, we could just kill them. And I think at that point, the frustration of not being able to fulfill the story plan that you'd originally had of them getting married, that idea stuck. It was, well, if we did kill him, what would that look like, and what would the story be? But how do you remember those conversations happening, and what was the energy in the room like at that time? It was, I mean, it must have felt a little dangerous. Like, is somebody gonna, are angry fans gonna break down the door and like carry us away to an asylum? What was that like?
Well, and we've talked about this, and I think some of us have, we remember a lot of things the same and some differently.
It's like Superman, but with Rashomon.
Yeah, and whenever you have like 15 people in a room, that's probably bound to happen. I do know this. I had been in, I think, two meetings before, where, and one, it was just the three books that existed at that time, where we just talked about classic Superman stories that existed before us, one of which was the Death of Superman. And we just sort of said, is there anything we could ever do with that? And it's like, yeah, maybe. And we'd talk about some ideas, but it just wouldn't lead to anything. Another time, I don't ever remember us joking, well, we could just kill him, in those things. It did come up again as a classic Superman story that we all had fond memories of, The Death of Superman. And it was Luthor who had killed Superman at that point. And it is a cool story. And we, kind of said, yeah, but then what?
Mm.
I do know that in this meeting, I'd been alerted to the fact that we weren't going to be doing the wedding and all that stuff. And it was really because my memory is the TV show just saying, look, if we want to build to a wedding on the TV show, you guys should hold off. And,
Mm.
or maybe even DC suggested it, but just the agreement was we'll do it in concert whenever it happens down the road. So um, I did walk into that meeting and with the notebook. I still have the notebook, and it had two ideas written on it. One was I have this one page. This is how deep I get on stuff. One, I just wrote Death of Superman, and on another one, Monster Trashes Metropolis, without any thought that those would ever be, regarded intact or as the same idea or anything else. And in the meeting, I threw out Death of Superman at one point, and it just didn't take. It went nowhere because we didn't have story to go with it. The Monster Trashes Metropolis idea for me was based entirely on Superman having so many villains who wore business suits. Toyman, the prankster, Lex Luthor, Mr. Z at that time. I mean, these were guys in suits. And this is Superman. I just wanted to draw a big kick-ass fight. That's
Right.
it. I mean,
Right.
that's artist Dan saying, I just want to draw a fight because we have so many guys that Superman can't hit. And, we were talking about different ideas and we were just getting nowhere. And Jerry did at that point say, oh, maybe we should just kill him, kind of like, and we started to explore it. And even that wasn't really taking on. I remember Mike very plainly saying, you can't just kill Superman. You can't just kill Superman. What's the story?
Right.
And we really started talking about Funeral for a Friend. What would the world be like without Superman? And we were talking about what the funeral scene would be like. And John and Wheezy kept talking about, like the JFK funeral.
Yeah.
And the riderless horse and all sorts of different things like that. And we got into this idea of how would the DCU react? How would the Kents react and Lois and all of that? Especially since here's Lois officially engaged to Clark Kent. Where the hell is Clark? If Superman's gone, what do you do with Clark?
Right.
And as we got into that, we started to work back and say, okay, so how does he die? And, then we talked about, well, would it be Brainiac? Would it be Luthor? Would it be someone else? And, somewhere in that twisted mass of conversation where people are throwing out different ideas, we dragged in this Monster Trashes Metropolis thought. And that's where we started to talk about this character that would become Doomsday. And we talked about it more and more and kind of like the idea of it being someone new and not one of the classic villains. And in part because, well, if Luthor saw someone else kill Superman, that would drive him nuts.
Yes. Yeah.
And so we could get into those themes and play with them. As we started to get into that more and more and say, okay, maybe this is the way to go. We had the 4 different pencilers in the room all sketched up their version of Doomsday, who didn't even have a name at that point. And I had a doodle I had already done. And so I sketched it up in a little bit finer detail. We all put our sketches, held them up or put them out or something and voted. And we went with mine. And I think Mike, somewhere along there, as we really started to firm up the storyline, he wrote Doomsday for Superman at the top of the charts that we had on the front of the room. And I remember saying, is there anyone in comics named Doomsday? Which was my great contribution, I guess. But and we sat there and thought about it, and no one could think of anyone called Doomsday. And we just said, that's great. Let's go.
Yeah.
So that's, in my memory banks, that's pretty much how it's copied.
I love that. And was it because you essentially were the creator of Doomsday that Mike said, all right, how about you write the issue itself where the final fight takes place? How did that come to fruition? Was it were you guys kind of like battling each other to get that issue? Or was it something where it was almost like, I don't know if I want to be the one officially responsible for this?
Sometimes, and usually what would happen in the room is someone who kind of was, for lack of a better term, principal generator of an idea or something like that, they would get to do the idea in their book. And that's usually how we work. And so, plus the idea that 75, just because it's number 75, was kind of a semi-significant issue, I guess. We started to orient it there. The idea of kind of playing with the time elements and the 4 panel per page bit,
Right.
that was Brett. Brett brought something up that started us along the line of, 4 panels a page to 3 to 2 to 1. And, I'm sitting there going, oh, an issue with all splash pages. I kind of like
Yeah,
that. And then
that was
until
such
I
a great
started to think
idea.
about, wait, how do you really tell a story that way? Because the first thing I ever did, just as an aside, was I did thumbnails of Superman 75. It was like a 45-page book in
Yeah.
my head that I had to cut panels out of or pages out of because I had X amount of pages. And really, there's a lot of stuff I wanted to have in there that I ended up taking out. It would be fascinating to one day do a special edition of Superman 75, like with the unused
I,
material.
I would absolutely adore seeing that. And
Yeah.
I imagine it's so challenging too, because this is that issue. It's finally like, okay, well, this is the one. It's going to end with Superman dying. And then you have to come up with, it helps to have more limited space in that regard. Like you said, you could cut out some ideas, but it is the variety of like, well, we know it's going to end with that final blow, but how do we tell the rest of this story visually getting there and coming up with that variety? What was the challenge of that? And was it a challenge, or was it pretty like storyboarding it out really helped you kind of visualize it in a way that made it straightforward?
Yeah, it's the idea of, in all comics, really, it's what are the missing elements between panels, right? So you go from a panel that has, say, a man and a woman talking to the next panel where they're kissing, but you don't see them take a closer step. You don't
Right.
see one take their hand and things like that. So if you think of Superman 75 in that context, an awful lot of stuff happens between pages and panels. We have essentially Superman saying goodbye to Lois. That's a splash page where he kisses her and then he's off to the fight, and that's goodbye, right?
Yeah.
So your brain as a reader, your brain and your eye have to make this jump from panel to panel. It would have been fun to have 30 pages of just Superman and Doomsday hitting each other, but you can't do that either. You have to be able to pull back and show Metropolis as an environment. We need to see the helicopter overhead. We need to see the destruction in the city. We need to see all of that. So not every page was necessarily going to be this boffo, rock'em, sock'em, punch out page,
Right.
because you still have to service the story. And I think one of the advantages of being the writer as well as the artist is, as a writer, I could very much embrace the important elements that need to come through in the story, and therefore expect the artist to deliver. So that's really what had to happen there. And it was interesting to go through the process of just skimming everything down to just scenes that were in essence these important moments. Even Jimmy with his camera taking the shot of Superman and Doomsday falling, and but you see it in that flip reverse side because it's the exterior of his lens, the
Right.
mirror sort of effect.
Oh
Uh,
yeah.
it was all of that, and then building to the double page spread and then the 3-page fold out. It was fun and challenging at the same time.
Yeah, well, I mean, it turned out beautifully. Obviously, it's a legendary. The whole arc is legendary, and I love just the timing of its release allowed for in just just an insane reaction from the real world. Not so different from what ended up happening in the fictional world, but because of just sheer like destiny, this issue landed like an explosion, and suddenly this issue was actual, like, news networks were talking about it as if it was a breaking story that happened in real. Superman actually like is dead, like in real life. What was that whirlwind like? Because you guys had been doing your thing for a while and
Mhm.
had a relative level of success that was like for the comic book world. There were fans and people love this stuff, but that blew it up to a whole other level. And of course, it's this controversial, quote unquote, decision to kill this character. And the presumption was, for some reason, because I guess the people reporting on it never have read a comic before, the presumption was that Superman was dead forever and never coming back. But what
Right.
was it like being caught in the what was it like being in the eye of the hurricane of that?
Yeah, it was absolutely crazy. And it was because part of it was just everything was happening so fast. And every time, you'd get up on a Wednesday and something would have happened and you think, well, there's no way that they'll top that one. And then the very next day, something would happen that did. And as for the creative team, we were all on the phone with each other all the time with this, and the basic conversation would start, can you believe this?
Do you have a favorite moment that you saw that you were like, I cannot believe this is what's happening right now?
I think for me, it was probably so one of the things that's thrown around very casually now is this concept of death threats, because on social media,
Yeah.
I guess that's easy to do. But Mike and I were both getting uh, enough of this that we were contracted by a security firm offering us their services. So
Wow.
I thought, wow, maybe I shouldn't answer my phone. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
I mean, honestly though, like what
but
were
seriously,
were you genuinely like, this is actually like I should be concerned here.
well,
Did it
all of a sudden, I had a business line and a house line, and somehow our private house line got out there, and people were calling up and just saying, "What's wrong with you? How can you kill Superman?" I've been buying Superman since I was 7 years old, and I bought it when it came out with Action Comics #1. It's like, well, you're lucky,
Yes, you're
but
lucky. You are set for life, sir.
yeah, we were getting a lot of those, and I mean, I had stores calling just to say, can you get us copies of Superman 75 because we're sold out? And I'd say, well, call your distributor or DC, and they'd say, we did. They don't have them. Do you? Like, I'm sitting there with 3,000 copies or something. No, it was all of that. But I think in many respects, the most gratifying part was by the time we were into the funeral. So Superman is dead. We're getting into the next 2 months of books after that, which is the funeral for a friend stuff.
Mm,
That's where we were getting opinion pieces in the New York Times and Washington Post that were kind of saying, what does it mean that Superman is gone from our world?
yeah.
And they were asking that in terms of popular culture or what they were remembered as reading as kids with comics or whatever. But that's what was really reflecting what we were saying in the books at the exact same time.
Yeah.
And the really incredible decision that DC made at that time is to say, you know, and we're going to end publication with Superman, I think 77, so that it looked like the books were done.
Yeah.
And what I keep getting now is the guys who are, say, like, 13 years old, which is core comic book reading age. They just saw that. It's like, holy shit.
Yeah.
Well, there are no more comics.
Right.
And that
Well,
was just this great sense of illusion. And it worked great for that, as well as, and this is the big one, is we were all so burned out. We desperately needed the break.
right.
And it
It
came
worked
at the
out in
best
many, many
possible time.
ways. Yes.
Yeah.
I was going to say it's fun to joke about it now looking back and say like, how could people not realize like this was not permanent? But you guys did such a great job. And like that publishing pause where the book was canceled and for a period of time was not being released to really seal the deal and say like, no, it's not a dream. It's not something where Superman's just going to brush himself off the next day. Like this is for real. The brilliance of that and the brilliance of the marketing, but also the brilliance of the storytelling. I think there could have been, and there had been in the past, like you said, the story that you guys loved. By the end of that issue, Superman is up and like, I'm good to go. Let's get back to it. The brilliance of the storytelling is that you let that moment sit and you do let people have that time to reflect and say like, what is a world without Superman like? We've been taking him for granted for so long. You don't appreciate the thing until it's gone. And you guys actually examined that. It's the same thing that made the Superman in Exile storyline so brilliant. It's like, okay, so Superman kills somebody or Superman gets killed. But what's the fallout from that? What happens? How does it affect him? How does it affect his family, his friends? And that's what I agree with you guys. I think the funeral for a friend, Death of Superman is a phenomenal, legendary moment. But the funeral for a friend is really, for me, the emotional core of that entire
Yeah.
story.
Yeah, and there's no doubt about that. I mean, that is definitely true. And one of the things we always understood is that with 4 titles, we could let things play out slowly. that when you have someone who's coming back every week to read the book, you could let things unfold in something of a more natural nature, right? And I think that certainly worked to our advantage. And the other part of it is, you know, in when people would ask us, Superman is coming back, right? When, all that stuff, there was not a plan. So that when we walked out of there having planned all of that, and even when Superman 75 came out, there was no set plan. We didn't know how Superman was coming back. We all had
Mhm.
various ideas as to how we might do it, but there was nothing set in place in that time to make it happen. So when people would ask us, it was, we could honestly say, I don't know. We did not have that. And it wasn't until 75 had been out for a bit that we all got together, and then it was clear we had to figure it out. Superman was going to have to come back some way, sometime, somehow, and how we were going to do it. And only then did we really start to talk about it and explore the idea. And ultimately, that became the four different characters claiming to be Superman.
Yeah.
But the whole time we did all that lead up to 75 and the funeral stuff as creators, we didn't know, and neither did DC. So
Yeah. And now
yeah.
30 years later, that's probably the story you're asked about. I imagine the most. That's probably the story you've talked about the most after all this time. Did you expect, I'm sure you knew it was going to be a landmark moment, but did you expect 30 years later that was going to be such a significant place in the legend of Superman?
No, but part of what I always tell people is that, so if you go back to the world of, that was 1992. Even then, the concept of everything getting gathered together and printed as a book was not common. They had done Man of Steel, trade paperback with the Byrne launch of Superman in it. But really, the genius to what was done at that time is they put together the Death of Superman trade paperback for $5, I think it was, that got into all the bookstores as well as the Targets, the Walmarts, and everything
Right.
else of the world before Christmas. So that could become that big thing that really also helped to deliver it. Now everyone thinks that, from a creative standpoint, oh, anything I do will be gathered and collected in a hardcover
Right.
edition. It wasn't like that. And I remember one of the first things I ever had reprinted was a Legion of Superhero story I had done. And Paul Levitz had written it, and it was included like at the end of the year in this little digest size best of the year DC digest edition or something like that. It's like,
Mhm.
wow, how about that? I got paid twice for doing this story, because it just wasn't common at that time. And so that, I think, is part of what also added to this idea that we can collect these things right away, that there will be a market for it.
And what I love about this, and like I said, I am sure like Death of Superman is what you were asked about the most and what you talk about the most. What is amazing about you and your career is you are still writing. I don't know. I don't know if anyone has officially tracked it, but is it reasonable to say that you have been writing Superman for possibly longer than anyone else on the planet right now? Because you've been doing it since what, late 80s, early 90s. So
Yeah, I don't know.
yeah, like I'm
I,
trying,
I
because I honestly can't think of anybody who's been like literally. There's even a new one coming out.
Yeah, we have a couple of things. Yeah,
Yeah.
I honestly, I don't know. I do know page counts have been brought up to me. And uh, I think from a writing standpoint, maybe I'm top two or three. From an artistic standpoint, I think maybe there's Kurt Swan and then
Mm,
me. I'm not sure.
that's incredible.
But I know you don't put them together, right? And I say, okay, but if you take the total amount of time spent on it and would count art and story, then yeah, it's up there. Kind of leave it at that.
Right. It's a completely reasonable thing to make. And the other thing is, the team, for whatever reason, it feels like I still see stuff from Jerry, and every so often you get like a guest issue of, oh, it's awesome that we get to see another issue by this team. And you have stuck with it and kept doing it consistently. And I remember when the Lois and Clark kind of the prelude to Rebirth came out, just seeing your name on it and thinking, as somebody who hadn't been totally in love with New 52, like, oh, well, I got to grab this. And just being so excited to see, like, you're still doing stuff. And then the Action Comics run for Rebirth, like, all of this stuff is amazing. And some of your best work. Is there something that you personally love? And this is not to, again, not to put down the death of Superman to anybody, but I feel like sometimes in the conversation, because that's so popular and has so absorbed the general populace's understanding of what you've done, what other stories have you done that you were so proud of that you would love people to check out more?
Well, I think, so if we go back to those days of the connected books, I did a number of, just one shot stories that I think still hold up very well today. It's kind of built, there's like one called Metropolis Mailbag, where we established that,
Yes.
at the end of every year, Superman goes to the post office, at least as the post office and mail existed then, and there'd be letters from all over the world asking Superman to help them out, that kind of thing, which adds to this sense of weight on Superman and this idea of responsibility and what can he do versus what can't he do or will he do for people. That would be one. We did a drunken driving issue. Uh, we did one, and when I say we, John and Wheezy and I, with Man of Steel and Superman, that kind of got into this concept of, spousal abuse. And so it's some of those that are the standalone issues that you get to do that are so much fun, because in doing those, I think you're really in 20 pages or so trying to address the importance of Superman as a very particular character.
Mm.
So those are always special. But then, some years later, I took a stab at Superman during the New 52, and that just was not going to work out. Not the way the character was envisioned by the company at that time.
Right.
But then, after that, as it was trying to find the right answer to Superman and what we might do, and convincing, DiDio at the time that a child for Clark and Lois would add to this rich tapestry of who Superman is. And this idea of, you look at the relationship that had been established with Batman and Damian, for example, where the world's greatest detective didn't know he had a kid. um, but what if you do that with Superman? What do you say about the character? And so getting that built and established, and adding even more.
So you
to that
you
character.
pitched the idea of John, like you were like,
Yeah.
I want to bring John. Okay, great.
Yeah. Yep. And so, that adds even more to it then. And when I say it means the world of Superman. And it isn't just to say, oh, if you just say, here's this kid, it means nothing. But if you say, we're going to address who Clark and Lois are as people, and start to get into what we did, where we said, they're going to go off and live in the hills of California with under essentially different identities, and kind of establish themselves that way, where Lois is writing the books, right, under a different name. And Clark is just doing what he does. That I think that it added something more to who they are. And that then becomes, I think, real strong lore for who this is as a character, and how he thinks of people by how he thinks of his family.
I think it's so funny because I remember thinking like Superman and Lois with a kid, like, okay. And what ultimately ended up happening is that run, like not just the Lois and Clark mini series, but the Your Action Comics run, and then Peter Tomasi and Patrick Gleason's main Superman run. That entire Rebirth run is, I would say, maybe my favorite Superman run ever. And that, so much of that is because of John and the role he plays and what that brings out of Clark and Lois's characters. So I just think that was such a brilliant idea that I was not, not skeptical, but I was like, oh, let's see how this turns out. And then it just ended up being like, blew me away. And I wasn't a dad at the time. Now I'm a dad. I have a 4-year-old now. And I go back and I'm rereading that run again and just experiencing it as a father. And I'm so appreciative of you for thinking of that and
Oh,
bringing that idea to the table. It's
thanks.
a
Yeah,
wonderful, wonderful story.
and that was it was a lot of fun. And so even when we did the first 8-issue series with Lee Weeks drawing it, and he just did brilliant stuff. It had this sense of warmth and humanity that I think had been missing from what they were doing in New 52 at the time,
Yeah.
that we could then bring back to it. And because when they first started, Lois and Clark really didn't even have a relationship in the New 52. So I kind of came in and said, well, not only do they have a relationship, here's this, and it's
Yes.
very different. And it gets us back to where people want, because I always said you had Action Comics #1, and yeah, there's Clark, there's Superman, but there's also Lois right from the start. So let's build on that and go from there. And even as we got into planning, what then became Rebirth, and we were all sitting in the room, and it was Tomasi and Gleason and me and editorial. We were talking about how this was going to work. It was a lot of fun planning that. It was somewhat like what we had done on the books earlier, in that
Yeah.
we were working very tightly, and we were also hitting on some old ideas. And one of the ones I wanted to get to was just this idea that I could have Clark Kent and Superman on the same cover. That there is just, if you go through the history of Superman comics, the number of times they had both on the same cover, like someone's identity was about to be revealed, or
Right.
what magical
It's all,
happening.
it is almost every issue.
It was, but it's because it worked, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
there was something about it that worked. So I sat there and said, yeah, and I want to do this. And so we have both, and we all latched onto that right away. So yeah, it was great fun. It was, and plus earlier I had talked about the idea of being able to do stories a little differently if you had a book every week. And certainly during Rebirth, Action had 2 issues a month, Superman had 2 a month. So we could both explore some of those different options that are harder to explore in a monthly comic.
Yeah. How would you say you've developed or changed as a writer now? There aren't like I said, there aren't a lot of comic book writers that really, like, people would say, "Oh, the peak was the 90s." And with you, I would be like, "I don't know. Like there's a current peak going on with Dan right now." But like, how would you say you've evolved as a writer from that time versus now?
Gee, Shawn, I don't know. I'm probably the last person that should be asked. I think part of it is, anyone, whether they're drawing or writing, you have to challenge yourself a little bit to do something you haven't done before, and to do new things differently, to think differently, to try different approaches. I've always done that. Last year I done a book called, The Batman First Night, which set
I
Batman back in 1939.
By the way, I love that story. I
Thank you.
loved it. And I'm sorry to interrupt, but I remember looking at it and thinking, "Oh, it's another kind of year one Batman story. Here we go again." But man, you knocked it out of the park. So good.
And well, thanks. I appreciate that. But yeah, working that way really is what is important to, I don't care, anyone in any creative field, that, you have to, I think there's a balance. You find out the language that is yours, whether it's as a writer or an artist. You find out that which is yours, but you still have to move beyond that. But you don't want to move so far that it's no longer recognizable as the same person's somehow, if that makes sense. You work within the same language, but you just try a whole lot of different things along with it.
And naturally you're gonna change. You're a human being. You're gonna evolve, and your stories are gonna change, and your characters are gonna change as a reflection of who you are. So in some ways, it's just very natural as part of life. You just get to reflect it into your art, which is great, because then you can have kind of a, not a lot of people get a document where they can look at and say like, "Oh yeah, that's what these ideas come from what my mindset was at that time." So it's
Right.
very, very cool. As we wrap this up, I do want to just have geek out a bit about all these amazing things that are coming out. First of all, we've got that Action Comics omnibus the Dan Jurgens omnibus that's coming out soon. I think in July, I want to say.
Sounds about right. I pay astonishing little attention to actual release dates. For
Clearly, me
me, it's
too.
due dates.
It's coming out this summer of
Yep.
Superman. That's happening. We've also got this Superman the World, which is a brand new story that you've
Yep.
written.
Yeah, and that's a nice hardcover edition. And what DC did there is they went to a number of different countries and found creators in each of those countries to do a Superman story.
I love
And
that.
so, representing America as are Lee Weeks and myself, and we
Right.
had a lot of fun with the story. And it's a really handsome edition. And some of the takes on Superman are really special and unique. So I think people will like that.
I'm very excited to read that. And then we've also this absolute Death of Superman book is coming out, and I've seen
Yes.
there are pictures of it. I don't know if the final art is matching it, but if it is, I'm so happy because what an intense it's just the gravestone. Here
Oh yeah,
lies
and
Superman.
so there are going to be a lot of unseen things in the book. And I know, for example, we found a very nice, clean set of Xeroxes of the pencils for the book. There,
Oh, how cool.
we had to reproduce from the Xeroxes, but at that time, it's not like scanners existed. So, that's going to be inside. I think the actual script for 75 is going to be in it, as well as a lot of things from a lot of the other books. So there, as I said, the magic of that one is going to be the packaging, in and of itself, it looks fantastic. And then B, there will be a lot of things that people haven't seen before.
That's awesome. I'm picking up all of these. I hope everyone listening is going to be picking them up as well. This is what a wonderful year to be a Superman fan. Feel like I've spent a little too long of a time in recent years complaining about like why are we treating Superman like this? Why is he kind of being given second shrift? I know everyone loves Batman, but Superman is special and we need to acknowledge him as such. But with the movie coming out, with all of this stuff, all of your work and so many other amazing writers and artists, this is a really exciting time to be a Superman fan.
Yeah, it is. And, one of them that we're also doing is a book called Superman Hero for All. And this is a treasury sized
Yes, that's
edition.
right. That's
Yeah,
right.
and it's the first treasury sized edition of new material that DC has done. I think since 1999
Wow.
when I did Superman Fantastic Four. So, we have that one coming out as well. And that ships, I believe, the week before the movie comes out. So
Gotcha.
that'll be a lot of fun. And
No,
that's
thanks for mentioning
hopefully
it.
going to be nice and special. Yeah.
That's going to be great. Well, and speaking of the movie, my friends Brad and Lisa Gullickson at the Comic Book Couples Counseling podcast, they've been asking this of everyone they've been talking to. And I would love to hear your thoughts as well. But what they're asking is, and we also, DC just did a great video asking writers and creators what their favorite Superman story is. What would you recommend? Somebody comes out of that theater and they're like, Dan, oh my God, I've been missing out on Superman my whole life. I've never read any stories. Where should I start? What should I do? Do you say like, hey, John Byrne run, let's go, like start there, pat myself on the back a little bit? Or what would you say? What are some of your favorite stories?
Well, I think, honestly, even though the origin has changed a bit, I might tell someone, okay, so you take the 6 issue series that John did, Man of Steel, right? But at the same time, also read the one that Jeff Johns and Gary Frank did,
Oh yeah,
because
Secret Origin.
yeah, because if you get those two together, I think do a really wonderful job of giving you an understanding of who Superman is and where he fits in the world, along with the characters around him. So, obviously, what Jeff and Gary did is has really strong bones in that first Christopher Reeve movie, right? I
Right.
mean, right down to the helicopter scene with
And I
Superman.
mean, obvious, and the characters are totally modeled after Margot and Chris
Oh,
Reeve. And
yeah, very much so. So there is that. But I also think that what Byrne did gives you a little more in terms, it's a little more expansive just because you also get to see the first meeting with Batman and Robin, for example. And you get, I think, more of this Kryptonian undercurrent that does serve the character as well. And so between those two, I think those are great places to start that give you that foundation you need. And that also helps you decide, what do I like? And what do I want to pursue from that?
Well, that's that. Dan, I am such an enormous fan and so grateful to you and everyone who has been involved creating this character and kind of shepherding him along. And you are such a crucial piece of what I love about Superman and what so many people all over the world love about Superman. So thank you. I'm so glad you're still doing it and still kicking ass writing amazing, amazing stories. I can't wait to see what's to come. And I'm really, really excited just to see where this movie goes because I am very much looking forward to it. But thank you so much for hanging out.
And that definitely makes two of us, by the way. And you're entirely welcome, Sean. This was great.